Hi everybody, this is Planning and Designing Research. So we're taking a look at methodology, sometimes called the method or the methods in a paper. Now this is not a research methods course, so I'll be focused more on the types of writing that are involved in methodology. If you need to know more about methodology and method, if you haven't taken a research methods class, that is something we can talk about individually via email, so let me know. So think about your methodology as your kind of research plan, what you plan to do in your study, or after your study when you're writing your article or your paper or your thesis, whatever. It's where you kind of explain what you did, and that allows people to replicate your research to understand what you did and how you got to the findings you got. So the research plan in that way is the core of any proposal or study, right? You can't propose to study something without explaining how you plan to study it. The plan begins with the research problem and research questions, but that's just the beginning, right? So you say the research problem, this is the problem I've noticed, and these are the questions I want to ask about that problem that I want to solve or answer in this study. So the methodology is thinking about then what should I do to get the answers I need for those research questions. The method section is often the easiest section to write because you're describing what you've already done. For a proposal, however, you must detail the planning for what you will do if your proposed study is funded. Presenting your intended methodology clearly will not only help you plan the study, but will also show the proposal evaluators that you have a well-planned study that is deserving of funding, right? Makes sense. You seem to know what you want to do and how you're going to do it. Makes you more likely to be funded. So, just like we looked at the introduction, it had different subsections. The method section has different subsections. So the purpose of the method section is to provide a rationale for, in other words, a reasoning for why you made these choices, right? And a detailed description of the research design. The method section is divided into subsections. So you have research design, conceptual, framework, or approach. In other words, what is the approach you're taking towards this problem? Participants or sample, who is involved is typically the case in social sciences like education, but it could be a study of a what, and so sample is another word we can use for that section. Materials. And we'll talk about what each of these sections is, but this is basically the physical attributes of the things and places you use to do your study if they're important to your study. Sometimes you won't even need a materials section. It depends on the kind of study you do, but oftentimes you do. It's a great place to share things like survey questions or interview questions or the environment of the study you're working on. So it's your classroom, for example, and why that might matter. And then finally, procedure. So data collection and data analysis. How do you collect your data? What did you actually do to collect your data, or what will you actually do? And then what will you do with that data, or what did you do with that data once you collected it? Some other possible subsections, though sometimes they can be integrated into those first four, are integrity measures, which basically says, how do I know the research I'm doing is valid or accurate or trustworthy? And data management. What am I going to do with the data that I've collected and analyzed to keep it safe? And that's important. We want to maintain anonymity for our research participants. So research design, we're talking about conceptual and framework, or our approach. So just as the manuscript has a framework built on literature theory or concepts, so does the methods section. Authors need to provide a rationale for design decisions and to ground the rationale in the extensive body of literature concerned with the type of method used. So if you decide to do a case study, you should be able to justify and explain why a case study is a good choice to answer your research question. You do that by looking at the literature on case studies, right? Or looking at literature that researches the same topic from a similar or different perspective, so you can explain why your choice is a smart choice at this moment for this study. Some studies will include the research question and or the general research hypothesis to clarify the purpose of the study. But ultimately, your method should be determined by how best to answer your research question, which should be justified through a discussion of relevant literature of that type of method. Beyond qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, categories of research are specific approaches and practices that are relevant to your research, right? So qualitative is that idea of using personally gathered information. We've talked about this before, right? Quantitative is working with numbers, so taking large groups of responses that can be assigned numbers, and we can study variables. And mixed methods is combining those two different approaches. But those are really big approaches. Within each of those types of research or approaches to research are specific things. So in qualitative, it might be case studies. In quantitative, it might be a survey. In mixed methods, it might be a survey followed by interviews. There are just a huge number of possibilities, and you'll find those possibilities through your research. When you think about participants or a sample, so samples can be composed of people, behaviors, events, or processes. A sample is what we actually want to study. So typically in education, we are looking at students or teachers or administrators or some combination of those things, right? Or parents, right? Because these are people involved in the education system. But we might look at a particular event to see what happens at that event, in which case we're looking at maybe a number of different people involved in that event or that process. But sometimes, every once in a while, we'll be studying something that is not a person. Maybe we're just studying texts. So we collect a whole bunch of portfolios from students that we want to be able to understand something, answer a question about the impact of a particular assignment we gave, and our sample then is taken from those portfolios. So we're not actually studying people in that case, we're studying something people have produced. So you can use the word sample, it depends, but participants is usually what we use when we talk about social science research. Researchers need to provide information about their sampling decisions. So how did you come to choose the people you chose, right? If you're doing action research in your own classroom, your sample is limited to those students who were in your class. Now, did you work with all of your students, or did you choose certain ones? If you chose certain ones, why did you choose those people? So sampling information and rationale should relate to the research problem, purpose, and research questions. So say I'm doing action research on disabilities in my classroom, working with students with disabilities in my classroom, and in my classroom of 25 students, only 4 of them have identified disabilities. And so I choose to reduce my sample to just those 4 students. That I'm going to do a case study about each one of them. And those 4 case studies will then allow me to do comparative analysis between their experiences so that I can learn something to answer my research question about disabilities in my classroom. That is what I'm talking about when we talk about describing our sample or describing our participants. Why did we select the people we selected? How do we come to that? The process and criteria used to select the sample and demographic information about the participants should be included in this section. So who are they? How can we describe them? And how are they chosen? Details on data collection tools are what goes into our materials section, right? So things like if you have a survey or an interview schedule, interview questions, a database you used for content analysis, some kind of software you used, maybe you're studying the impact of a particular software tool, a particular program in your classroom. Those are things that are data collection tools, right? The things you use to collect data. And a justification for the use of the tools. So if you decided to use a survey, how did you come up with those survey items? Same thing with interview questions. How did those interview questions come to be identified as important to answering your research question? Details should also be provided on the actual data collection situation. So it's the physical setting, location, and any audio or video recording tools that you might use so you can review them, right? So if you're doing a case study, a lot of times we will record them, either audio or video, and so we can go back and look at them over and over again, right? But we might have them transcribed, and so we'd also discuss that process of transcription. Do we transcribe all of the data? Do we leave anything out? For example, names to keep it anonymous? Do we edit our videos or audio recordings? These are all kind of material decisions about the things in our study. Procedure, data collection and data analysis. There's 2 sections of procedure. A lot of procedure focuses just on the data collection. So what is the process through which data are collected? And do data collection decisions clearly flow from the conceptual framework? In other words, you say you're doing a quantitative case study with a set of interview questions over a period of time. Well, did you actually do that when you collected the data, right? So you need to be able to show that process that it worked and was what you said it was going to be in your introduction, right? Similarly, data analysis, researchers need to report on the steps involved in how data were reduced, analyzed, and interpreted. So say you do a case study with your 4 students with disabilities, and what you realize as you're working is that there are certain themes that are in common across these students. And so you reduce the data to focus only on those 4 themes in your case studies. You have to explain that you did that and why you did it, right? You did it because you identified a theme which allowed you to reduce and focus your analysis on the most relevant material. You also need to provide a rationale for your specific data analysis tools or methods grounded in the literature, right? So if you're doing quantitative data and you want to use SPSS, you will explain why SPSS is the best tool for analyzing your survey data because it's predictive and tends towards creating models which allow you to understand not only correlation but also causation between different items in your survey, right? But you'd have to find that information, right, as you research your method. Now, the good news is once you're a researcher and you're steadily researching, you'll get used to the methods that you tend to use, and we'll have to do a lot less work to figure out how to explain or rationalize your decisions, right? Because you'll already understand those decisions. Integrity measures are the methods a researcher uses to verify plausibility or to diminish interference, contamination, or degradation of any part of the research process in order to strengthen the process. These are matters of integrity. So, for example, we know that things that are being studied are often affected by the fact that they're being studied, right? So if I do teacher observations and I go and I sit in this classroom, the students are going to change their behavior and the teacher is probably going to change his or her behavior because they're being observed by an outsider. So how might we get around that? Well, instead of doing that, maybe we set up a camera and we observe it from another room, right? It depends on the kind of research we're doing, whether that's a reasonable integrity measure or not, right? Part of what we might want to see is what happens when we're in the room, right? So no matter what standard is used to verify quality and credibility of study, the author must describe the steps taken and the rationale for the steps. This is less important in a proposal, but very important when you talk about your methods of what you did to make sure your study was of quality and credibility, right? This description might be in the form of several sentences within the procedure section or a whole separate subsection within the methods section. It really depends on how important. So if you're doing a lot of statistics work in a quantitative study, you might have a full section on integrity measures which talk about truth values and those issues, which I won't go into because once again, this is not a methods class. But those kind of studies require more discussion of how statistical data was treated to ensure integrity, whereas some other different kinds of studies might require just a couple of sentences in the procedures to say, like, this is what I did and this is how it preserved the integrity of my research. Data management is a similar thing. So data management concerns include answers to were the data transcribed or recorded completely? Were there decisions made to paraphrase or eliminate sections? You see how that can kind of connect to your data analysis? And how are data stored? That can definitely connect to your data collection, right? So what did you do with the data when it was in your possession? Sometimes this is an ethical issue, right? So we want to ensure anonymity for our study subjects. And so noting that we are keeping things anonymous, that we are not storing artifacts of our study, along with identifying information, things like that. So once again, it can be commonly discussed in participants or procedure subsections by the addition of a few sentences, or it could be an entire separate subsection, particularly if you're working with children or other populations that are at more risk of having their rights violated in studies, right? Because they can't give consent. So children, people under the age of 18, right? You have to be really careful with their data and the way you collect data, what that data are, and how that data are stored. And but there are other populations as well, like the severely ill, like prisoners. And so we'll talk about ethics later in the semester. But just know that data management is basically that idea of talking about how you managed your data after they were collected. Okay? So choose a methodology for your proposal. So consider your research question and how it might be answered. How do you think you can answer that question? What do you need to find out to answer that question you're asking? Review the literature on the topic and identify the methods common to the field of study. So a lot of times in education, you're looking at action research in the classroom, you're looking at case studies, you might be looking at surveys across larger populations, depending on the kind of thing they're working with, right? Review the literature on the method that seemed most relevant to you, right? So the kind of study you're thinking about running, well, go and look up like what is education research using that method look like, and that can help you think about how you're going to design your own study. And then connect your method to your purpose and research question, as well as your theoretical or conceptual framework. So once you kind of decide like this seems to fit, we have to explain why it seems to fit for the reader, because we're not inside your heads. Remember, in proposals and in articles, we're always trying to explain our complex ideas and their connections so that the reader can understand them clearly, see where we got from point A to point B to point C. If you have any questions, send me an email. I'm here to help. Thanks.